Meet Edward Hayes, a 46-year-old tech CEO in Denver whose innovations have changed lives but whose own past remains unresolved. For years, Edward built success on precision and control, but one snowy afternoon, a boy's laughter stops him cold. 10-year-old Caleb is selling handmade toys on a street corner, his fingers deft, his ideas oddly familiar. The creativity, the determination. Edward sees himself, and he can't look away. When he investigates, Edward discovers a truth he was never meant to find. Caleb is his son. The boy he never met. The boy his own brother Paul deliberately kept hidden by erasing messages from Anna, the woman Edward once loved and left behind. Now, Edward must face the guilt of absence and the fury of betrayal. But winning Caleb's trust won't be easy, especially when his brother launches a brutal custody battle, accusing Edward of being unfit to parent. As Edward walks away from a $1 million deal to fight for a child he barely knows, a single handmade toy with the word family etched into it becomes the symbol of something far greater than wealth, a second chance. Will Caleb forgive him? Can Edward rebuild the bond that was stolen? Subscribe to witness this heartfelt story of redemption, legacy, and love rediscovered. Edward Hayes had built his empire with the kind of sharp instinct most people only pretended to have. At 46, he wasn't just a CEO. He was the name behind Hayes Tech, the Denver-based firm that turned childhood ideas into billion-dollar design patents. But on that chilly November morning, as he stepped out of his town car near 17th and Arapahoe, something stopped him cold, and it wasn't the wind. Across the street, beside a bus stop shaded by rusted scaffolding, a young boy knelt on the sidewalk. He couldn't have been more than 10. His jeans were too short at the ankles, and his hoodie looked 2 sizes too big. But what caught Edward's eye wasn't the boy's clothes, it was what he was doing. The boy was building something. Small pieces of wood, a set of mismatched wheels, rubber bands, electrical tape. From a distance it looked like chaos, but to Edward it was genius. The kid's hands moved quickly, confidently, not just tinkering, but testing. He spun a wheel, adjusted a joint, reinforced a seam. Then with a slight smile he pushed the tiny creation, a handmade toy truck, across a patch of concrete. It rolled smooth and fast. It didn't wobble. It worked. Edward didn't realize he'd stepped closer until he heard the boy speak. $10, or $5, if you want the scratched one. There was no hesitation, no fear, just business. Edward stared, unsure why he suddenly felt short of breath. The boy's eyes were dark, wide, and intensely focused. But it wasn't the eyes that shook him. It was the posture. The way the kid cocked his head to the side after a successful pitch. The faint, unconscious tap of 2 fingers on his knee while waiting for a response. It was his own habit, his exact habit. He'd done that tap since he was 6, sitting on the floor with a screwdriver and a broken clock. "Where did you learn to make that?" Edward asked softly. The boy blinked. "No one. I just figured it out." Edward crouched slightly, his voice gentle. "You have a name?" The kid looked at him, guarded now. "Why? You gonna call someone?" Edward shook his head. "Just curious." The boy hesitated, then muttered, "Caleb, Caleb." Edward felt the name thud against something buried deep, something he hadn't named in years. He opened his mouth to ask more, but a woman's voice broke the air. "Caleb!" A woman in a windbreaker jogged up, panting slightly. "You can't just run off like that." She put a protective arm around him, eyes narrowing at Edward. "Is he bothering you?" "No, Mom," Caleb said. "He just asked about the truck, Mom." Edward's gaze snapped to her face. She was older than he remembered, her hair now streaked with gray, but the curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes, it couldn't be. "Anna," he breathed. She froze, her arms tensed around the boy. "Edward?" she said, almost inaudibly. The air around them shifted, the sidewalk noise faded, and suddenly Edward's world cracked at the edges. He looked back at Caleb, a boy named Caleb, building things from nothing, confident, precise, and 10 years old. 10. Edward swallowed. Is he? But Anna was already backing away. We should go. Caleb tugged her sleeve. Mom, what's going on? She didn't answer, just steered him down the block, clutching him like he might vanish. Edward stood there, numb, watching them disappear into a narrow alley of run-down apartments. His heart pounded against his ribs. Questions roared in his mind. A name, a look, a habit, and a decade of silence. He'd spent years building his legacy. But now, it seemed he'd missed the most important creation of his life. And he needed answers. Fast. The name Caleb echoed in Edward's mind long after Anna and the boy disappeared around the corner. He didn't go back to the office. Instead, Edward walked. Through the narrow back streets of 5 Points, past forgotten lots and flickering neon signs. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself outside a corner diner, the kind that hadn't changed since the 80s, the kind where he and Anna used to sit for hours, talking about the future they never built. He sat in the last booth near the window. The waitress poured him black coffee. He didn't touch it. Instead, he opened his phone and typed the name, Caleb Mathers. Then, Anna Mathers. He didn't even know if she'd kept her last name, but he had to try. After 15 minutes of cross-checking addresses and business licenses, he found it. Anna Mathers. Her name was listed on a tenant registry for a rundown apartment building off Colfax Avenue, the same direction she had walked with the boy, Unit 204. He flagged a ride and sat quietly in the back seat, the world outside rushing past like static, but in his chest, something unfamiliar was tightening. Not fear, exactly. Something heavier. He had built Hayes Tech from the ground up. He had stood in boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, stared down competitors without blinking. But this walk up a dim staircase to knock on a faded apartment door, this shook him. He knocked once, then again, the door opened. Anna stood there. No makeup, hair pulled back. Her eyes weren't surprised, just tired. You came, she said quietly. I need to understand, Edward replied, his voice steady but low. That boy, Caleb, is he mine? Anna looked away for a long moment. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe. You tell me, she whispered. You saw him. I saw myself, Edward said, in his hands, in his confidence. She nodded. That's because he is yours, Anna said softly. Edward's breath caught in his throat. I tried to tell you, she went on. I wrote, I called, but you never answered. That's not possible, he said, stunned. I never got a call, never saw a letter. Anna's eyes sharpened. Then maybe ask your brother. Paul was the one who told me you were too busy and had moved on. He told me not to call again. Edward stared at her, shaken. Paul knew? He was the only person I could reach. The number you had back then? He answered it. He said you'd changed it. He made it very clear I wasn't welcome in your new world. Edward took a step back. Why wouldn't he tell me? You figure that out, Anna said quietly. I was just trying to do right by Caleb. There was silence between them, heavy and raw. Then Anna opened the door wider. You want to see his room? Edward stepped inside slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. But it was clean, with a lived-in warmth he hadn't felt in years. On the far wall, beside a worn couch, was a makeshift bookshelf lined with parts. Gears, coils, broken motors. At the center of it sat a small work table, half covered in wooden wheels and scraps of cardboard. Above it, taped to the wall, was a single drawing. A sketch of a toy glider. In shaky handwriting, beneath it, the words, "Caleb's Dream. Own a Toy Company." Edward's chest tightened again. The drawing was crude, but it was his own design language. Symmetrical lines, elegant symmetry. The same style he'd taught himself in his mother's basement 4 decades ago. Anna stood beside him, arms crossed. "He thinks his dad is just some guy who left when he was born. I never had the heart to tell him the truth, that his father didn't even know." Edward turned to her. "Let me make this right." She shook her head slightly. "It's not that simple." "I know," he said, "but I need to try." Just then, a small door creaked open down the hallway. Caleb's voice drifted out, still groggy from a nap. "Mom?" Anna froze. "You should go, please." Edward opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. Instead, he looked at the drawing one more time, then nodded. "I'll be back," he said quietly, "with the truth." And as he stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the city suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if everything he thought he knew had just shifted. The image of Caleb's toy glider sketch still lingered in Edward's mind as he sat behind his mahogany desk, untouched coffee going cold beside him. He hadn't returned to work to get things done. Not really. He just needed silence, space. But it wasn't silence he got. It was Paul. Edward's older brother swept into the office without knocking, dressed in a sharp gray suit and a grin that never quite reached his eyes. "Missed you at the conference call," Paul said casually. "Everything okay?" Edward stared at him for a long second. "You spoke to Anna." Paul froze for just a breath. "Anna who?" "You know exactly who," Edward replied quietly but firmly. "Anna Mathers, 10 years ago. You intercepted her calls." Paul chuckled, but his shoulders stiffened. "You're dredging up old flames now?" "She had my son, Paul," Edward said. "My son. You never told me." That wiped the smirk off Paul's face. Edward rose slowly, his voice low. "She said she called. She said she wrote. I didn't believe it. Until I saw the kid. And I knew. The way he talks. The way he thinks. He's mine." Paul walked to the window, buying time. "Edward, listen. You were on the verge of launching Hayes Tech back then. You were barely sleeping. You didn't need that drama. You decided that for me?" Edward asked, stunned. Paul turned, calm returning to his voice. "She was broke. Single. You were vulnerable. It wasn't the right time." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. "That wasn't your choice to make." "I protected you," Paul insisted, "and I protected the company." Edward shook his head. "You buried a part of my life, my child. You stole that from me. I did what had to be done." "No, Paul," Edward said bitterly. "You did what was convenient for you." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the city traffic below. Then Edward opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old folder, the one he'd labeled Anna M. years ago but never dared to revisit. Inside, untouched letters, unopened, postmarked, some slightly torn at the corners, sat like ghosts. One caught his eye, the handwriting unmistakable. "Edward, if you're reading this, it means you cared enough to try." His throat tightened. Paul didn't move. Edward placed the letter gently back inside the folder. "You lied to me," he said, "for years." Paul sighed, as if exhausted. "And what do you want now? To play catch with a 10-year-old in a public park? Come on, Ed. You don't even know this kid." "No," Edward said, voice quiet, "but I will." Paul scoffed. "This is going to cost you more than you think." Edward looked up. "I've built an empire. I've rebuilt it twice. But this is something I can't build back with money." Paul crossed his arms. "And what's your plan? Step into that kid's life and pretend you're some hero? He's not going to want anything to do with you." Edward didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the office window and looked out over Denver's skyline. The sun had begun its descent, casting a warm glow across the buildings. Somewhere in that vast sprawl, his son, was tinkering with spare parts and cardboard, dreaming of something bigger. And all these years, Edward had no idea. A knock at the door pulled them both from their silence. It was Martha, Edward's assistant. "Sorry to interrupt, sir," she said gently, "but Ms. Halbert from legal just called. She says there's some irregularities in your brother's messaging records from 2013. "Thank you, Martha," Edward said, not taking his eyes off Paul. The message landed. Paul stiffened. "You're looking into me now?" "I'm looking for the truth," Edward replied. Paul narrowed his eyes. "You're making a mistake." Edward turned back, calm but resolute. "No, I made the mistake of trusting you. Now I'm making it right." Paul didn't respond. He simply straightened his cufflinks and left without another word. Edward exhaled slowly. Then he opened the letter from Anna. The first one. Inside, a small pressed flower fell into his palm. A daisy. Simple, bright, familiar. At the bottom of the note, one line stood out. "He makes toys the way you used to make hope." Edward sat down heavily, the daisy still in his hand. The daisy from Anna's letter sat pressed between Edward's fingers as he stared at it through the soft amber light of the Denver sunset. That small, faded flower held more weight than any signature he'd ever inked on a corporate deal. It smelled faintly of dried paper and years lost. He knew what he had to do. By morning, Edward sat alone in the company's IT vault with a forensic tech team. The cold room hummed with servers and silence. "We've recovered the old backup," the technician said. "The 2013 messaging archive. You were right. Some deletions were manual, logged in under your brother's admin credentials." Edward swallowed hard. "Find the deleted messages. All of them." Hours passed. Then, "Sir," the technician called softly. "We found her. Anna Mathers. Multiple emails. Some flagged as urgent, some unopened. All deleted, within minutes of receipt." The screen displayed subject lines that stopped Edward's breath. "Please read. It's important. You need to know. It's about the child." Each timestamp matched a critical juncture in his life: product launches, investor meetings, press runs. All the moments when Paul had insisted he focus, told him to cut distractions. Edward's jaw clenched. He whispered, "He kept her away from me." He scrolled down and paused at one message that had never even been opened. "His name is Caleb." That name, his son's name, looked foreign in his inbox, like a stranger trying to get in through a locked door. "Print everything," Edward said. "Secure backups. This never disappears again." That night, Edward sat in his high-rise condo, lights off, overlooking the city skyline. The printed emails were fanned across the coffee table like torn pages of a book he was too late to read. But one thing stood out. Anna had tried, over and over. Not just once, not just out of panic or obligation, but with intent, with hope. He picked up her last message. "I don't need your money. I don't even need your help, but he deserves to know who he is." The words pierced through the years of silence, all the way to the core of who he used to be. He stood, went to the drawer, and pulled out an old photograph. Him and Anna on the steps of her college apartment. Her hair was wind-tangled, her smile defiant. She tucked a small daisy behind his ear as a joke, and he let her. He remembered laughing, then kissing her before the camera clicked. He hadn't thought of that day in a long time. Now, it felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The next morning, Edward drove through a part of Denver he hadn't seen in decades. Cracked sidewalks, faded murals, and old brick housing complexes lined the street. The Bentley drew attention, but he ignored the stairs. He stopped in front of a modest building with peeling green paint. He checked the address twice. This was it, Anna's apartment. He knocked once, then again. After a pause, the door opened. Anna stood there, older but unchanged. Her eyes were still fire and gentleness all at once. Her arms crossed. "You found me," he nodded. "You tried to reach me. I didn't know." "No," she said quietly. "You chose not to look." "I thought you left," he said, guilt rising in his chest. "Paul said it was over, that you moved on." She shook her head, voice steady but tired. "I sent letters, emails. I called your office. Then I stopped, because silence hurts more than rejection." He stepped back, breath catching. "Anna, he deleted everything. I have the proof. Paul, he erased you." Anna blinked. "You didn't know?" "No," Edward whispered, "but I should have." There was a long silence. Then she said, softer now, "You missed 10 years." "I know," he said, "but if you'll let me, I want to make it right." From inside the apartment, a small voice called out, "Mom, is dinner ready?" Edward froze. Anna glanced over her shoulder. "That's him. That's Caleb." Edward's eyes brimmed. "Can I meet him?" She looked at him, searching his face. "Not yet. Let me talk to him first." He nodded, stepping back. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Before she closed the door, she looked at the daisy still in his hand. Dried, fragile, but whole. A flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "if he says yes." As the door shut, Edward stood there for a moment longer, wind pressing against his coat. He didn't feel the cold. He felt hope. The daisy was still in his coat pocket when Edward returned to the quiet park where he had first seen Caleb. Children's laughter echoed from the worn-down playground nearby, but he wasn't listening. He was waiting, again, with a different kind of hope. Anna had said Caleb was open to meeting him. Not dinner, not a long conversation. Just a hello. Edward could accept that. From the far end of the park, Caleb appeared. The same tousled brown hair, the same focused eyes. He held a small wooden box in one hand, and his backpack patched with duct tape was slung over the other shoulder. "Hey," Edward said, rising slowly. Caleb stopped a few feet away. "You're the man with the car." Edward smiled gently. "That's one way to remember me. I'm Edward, but, people call me Ed." Caleb shrugged, unconvinced. "Okay." There was a long pause. Edward motioned to the bench beside him. "Want to sit?" Caleb eyed him for a moment, then dropped onto the edge of the bench, keeping the toy box between them like a shield. Edward tried not to let his nerves show. "I saw your display last week. Those toys, they're brilliant." Caleb gave a small shrug. "It's just scrap wood. Old motors, stuff people throw out." "That's where the best ideas come from," Edward said softly. "Making something out of nothing." Caleb glanced at him just for a second, then looked away. "I used to do that too," Edward added. "My first invention was a rubber band car made from a cereal box." Caleb's eyes flickered again, but his tone was skeptical. "Why are you really here?" Edward inhaled deeply. He'd rehearsed 100 answers, but now none of them felt right. "I don't want to lie to you," he said gently. "The truth is, I think I might be your father." Caleb stiffened. His hands gripped the box tighter. Edward continued, slower. "I didn't know. I promise you. I didn't know you existed until last week. But when I found out, I wanted to meet you, to see who you are, not to show off money or cars or anything like that." Caleb studied him carefully. "You're rich, right?" Edward nodded. "Yes." "Like, really rich?" "Yes." So why would a rich man want to talk to me? Edward felt the question like a punch to the chest. Because you matter, he said quietly. Because when I saw you, I saw a kid with ideas, with heart, with courage, and when I looked at you, I saw myself, or, maybe, the better version of who I used to be. Caleb didn't speak. The wind rustled through the trees. After a long moment, he opened the box on his lap. Inside was a small wooden bird, carved from pine and painted in bold colors. Its wings flapped when a crank on the side was turned. I made this last month, Caleb said. It doesn't sell well. Most kids want robots or drones. Edward watched the wings flutter. It's beautiful. Caleb nodded. Mom said I should keep it. She said, sometimes the thing you build for yourself is the thing that teaches you the most. Edward felt his throat tighten. She's right. Caleb closed the lid again, then looked up at him. If you're my dad, why weren't you there? Edward swallowed. Because someone kept your mom's messages from me. I thought she'd left. I thought she didn't want to be found. But you didn't look? Caleb asked, his voice low but steady. No, Edward admitted, and I regret that. I regret it every day. Silence fell again. Then Caleb stood. Thanks for telling me the truth, he said quietly, but I'm not ready to call you Dad. Edward nodded slowly. That's okay. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to know you. Caleb hesitated. Can I think about it? Of course, Edward said, standing as well. Take all the time you need. Caleb gave a brief nod and turned to walk away. But just before he reached the path, he stopped, turned back, and held out the bird. You can borrow it, he said, almost awkwardly, but bring it back. Edward stepped forward and gently accepted the wooden bird, holding it like something fragile and sacred. I will, he said softly. I promise. As Caleb disappeared down the sidewalk, Edward looked down at the bird in his hand. The paint was chipped, the wings uneven, the crank stiff. But it worked. It flew. Just like Caleb. The wooden bird rested on Edward's desk, its painted wings frozen mid-flight. He hadn't touched it since Caleb placed it in his hand, not out of neglect, but reverence. Every time he looked at it, he felt the weight of a promise still waiting to be fulfilled. He was halfway through an email when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Edward Hayes. Meet me at 6th and Wabash, the diner. I don't want you showing up at our building again. It was Anna's voice. Clipped, tired, but steady. She hung up before he could reply. The diner was small and dim, with peeling vinyl booths and a jukebox stuck on a loop of Motown ballads. Anna sat in the corner, nursing a chipped mug of coffee. The second Edward stepped inside, she looked up, not with surprise, but with something colder. Resignation. He slid into the seat across from her. Thank you for calling. I didn't do it for you, she said quietly. Caleb came home confused. Quiet. That's not like him. Edward nodded, folding his hands. He asked good questions. He always does. Silence lingered between them until she finally spoke again. Why didn't you look for me? Edward inhaled slowly, the question burning deeper than she could know. I thought you didn't want to be found. Paul told me you left. He showed me a note, said you moved on, said you were done. Anna leaned back, her jaw tightening. I sent you 6 messages, emails, letters. When I didn't hear back, I assumed you made your choice. I never got any of them, he said, voice low. Not until I found them last week, buried in Paul's old account. He intercepted everything. Anna went still, then, softly, so he lied. Yes. She looked down, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. And you believed him. Edward didn't try to deny it. I was stupid. I trusted him more than I trusted what we had. I told myself I was protecting my company from chaos. I didn't want to believe I was the kind of man who walks away from love. Anna's eyes lifted, sharp now. But you were, whether you meant to or not. He nodded slowly. I was. They sat in that truth, letting it hang in the air like steam off the coffee. Caleb has never asked about his father, she said after a moment. He assumed you were gone, dead. I never corrected him because I didn't want him to hate you. Edward's chest ached. You could have told him the truth. And burdened him with your silence? No, I chose peace. He swallowed hard. I want to fix this. I don't mean just showing up with gifts or paying bills. I want to know him. Be there. Show up. Every day. Anna shook her head. You don't just get to insert yourself now. This isn't about your guilt. I know, he said gently. It's about Caleb, and he gets to decide. Anna narrowed her eyes. You really think you can be his father after all this time? I don't know, but I want to try, if you'll let me. She stared at him, long and hard. Then finally, and not without bitterness, she said, You're 5 years too late, Edward. I know, he whispered. But she didn't leave, and she didn't ask him to. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a faded envelope with his name written in her handwriting. I sent this the week Caleb was born. I kept the duplicate, just in case you ever came back. He took it with trembling hands, sliding out, the letter like it might dissolve under his fingers. It was short, honest, hopeful, and dated July 12th, the exact day Caleb had arrived in the world. As he read, Edward felt the cracks in his chest widen, not from pain, but from a kind of quiet awakening. All the years he'd convinced himself he didn't want a family, didn't need one, fell away in an instant. He looked up. Anna? I can't go back, but I can be here now. She nodded slowly, her voice low. You'll have to prove that. Not to me. To him. I will. Anna stood. Don't make promises you can't keep. I won't, he said. She paused at the door, then turned slightly. He liked that you didn't talk down to him. He told me that. A soft smile touched Edward's lips. He deserves respect. Then start there. She left, and Edward sat alone in the diner, the letter in one hand, the wooden bird in the other, 2 pieces of the past he could never undo, and 2 reasons to fight for the future. The letter still sat on Edward's nightstand, its paper worn from too much rereading. He hadn't told anyone about it. Not even his assistant, not even his lawyer. It was Anna's words, her raw hopes from 10 years ago, that kept his guilt grounded and his resolve alive. But resolve didn't stop Paul from making his move. It started with a voicemail from Human Resources. Mr. Hayes, we've received a formal inquiry regarding your parental fitness. It was submitted under a sealed request, but it names Caleb and questions your recent absence from board meetings. Edward didn't need to guess. Paul. That same afternoon, he walked into his office on the 42nd floor and found Paul seated at his desk, legs crossed, swirling a glass of sparkling water like it was bourbon. You've been busy, Paul said coolly. Edward shut the door slowly. Don't pretend this is about the company. Oh, I'm not pretending. I'm being transparent. The board has concerns. Investors are jittery. You've missed 2 quarterly strategy meetings. Now you're walking into low-income housing projects like it's some personal crusade. Edward's jaw clenched. I'm spending time with my son. Paul raised an eyebrow, almost amused. Ah, yes. The sudden son. 10 years old. Born of a flame you abandoned. And now, surprise, he's your heir. Very noble. Very reckless. Edward stepped closer. Did you delete Anna's messages? Paul's expression didn't flicker. You were drowning back then, Ed. Panicking after the boardroom coup. I shielded you from chaos. That woman was a liability. You buried my child. Paul stood, his tone sharpening. I protected this company. You should be thanking me. Edward's voice dropped. You don't get to decide who I love or who I fight for. Paul turned to the window, arms behind his back. Funny thing about custody law, it doesn't care about last-minute regret, especially when the other parent's willing to cooperate, or when someone files for guardianship first. Edward froze. You filed? Paul looked back. I've already submitted a petition, under my name, guardianship of Caleb, pending review. Anna doesn't have a lawyer. You don't have time. The words landed like ice. You don't even know him. Paul shrugged. Don't need to. I just need to look responsible, stable, and make you look erratic, emotionally compromised, possibly trying to manipulate Anna for sympathy. Edward took a breath, a deep one. He couldn't lunge, couldn't scream. That would be playing into Paul's hands. You're using a child to hurt me, he said quietly. Paul gave a faint smile. I'm protecting the company from a man who forgot his place. That night, Edward didn't go home. He parked outside the community rec center, the same one where he'd seen Caleb helping other kids learn how to build small toys from broken parts. It was closed now, but in the dim light, he could still see the paint-chipped sign above the door. He thought about all the years he'd spent building empires, while a child he never knew crafted joy from scraps. He pulled out his phone. Anna, it's me. Paul's trying to take him. He's filed for guardianship. I don't know how far he's gone, but I need to talk to you. I need your help. His voice cracked as he ended the message, and for the first time in years, Edward felt scared, not of losing money, or a deal, or his reputation. He was scared of losing Caleb, again. 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived at Anna's doorstep. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a preliminary custody motion, stamped, signed, and bearing Paul Hay's name as the petitioner. There was also a typed statement claiming Edward was emotionally unstable, citing business absences, erratic behavior, and a disregard for professional responsibility. Beneath it all, there was a photo. Edward and Caleb, taken by someone, somewhere, without their knowledge. They were seated on a bench, Caleb showing him how a small wooden puzzle worked. Edward was smiling. Caleb looked proud. Anna stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and texted Edward. We need to meet, tonight, and bring that lawyer of yours. At the end of the day, Edward stood at the edge of something he'd never faced before. Not a market crash or hostile takeover, but something deeper. The real question wasn't whether he could win. It was whether Caleb could trust him to stay. The echo of Anna's words still rang in Edward's ears as he stood at the edge of the conference room window, watching the Denver skyline bathed in early morning haze. You said you'd fight for him, Edward. Then fight. The legal meeting with Anna and her public defender the night before had been grueling, raw, emotional, necessary. She had agreed to testify against Paul's custody motion, but only if Edward proved he wasn't just chasing redemption on paper. Now he had to prove it. Behind him, the boardroom buzzed. The deal with the Japanese firm, Yamato Systems, was hours from closing. A merger that would push Hay's innovations into global expansion. It had taken 18 months, 3 continents, and over $100 million in pre-merger capital. Paul sat at the head of the table. We just need your signature, Ed, he said, smugly confident. Everything's aligned. Tokyo is watching. You walk away now, and the shareholders will hang you. Edward turned slowly. His tie was still loose from the night before, his jaw unshaven, but his voice, when it came, was steady. I'm withdrawing my name from the deal. A silence fell over the room. Someone's pen clattered onto the table. Paul blinked. Excuse me? I'm withdrawing, effective immediately. Cancel the press release. Paul stood abruptly, stepping toward him. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't about your son," Edward cut in, voice firmer now. "Everything's about my son. He needs me present, not buried in acquisitions, not distracted by quarterly margins. You're throwing away decades of work." "No," Edward said quietly. "I'm protecting the one thing I never worked hard enough for." He pushed the contract folder across the table and walked out without another word. Later that day, Edward sat on a bench outside Caleb's school, a handcrafted toy truck in his hand, one of the first models he'd ever built in college, something he'd kept in a drawer for years, a symbol of where it all began. As the final bell rang, kids began pouring out of the building, backpacks bouncing. Caleb spotted him. His steps slowed. "You're back," Caleb said cautiously. "I'm not just back," Edward replied. "I'm staying." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "What about your company? You said you had meetings." "I walked away from one today," Edward said softly, holding up the wooden truck. "This was mine, a long time ago. I built it from spare pieces in a garage when no one believed in me. I kept it because I thought it reminded me of who I was." He looked at Caleb. "Turns out, it reminds me of who I want to become." Caleb studied the toy. Then his gaze drifted up. "Why would you give all that up? For me?" Edward swallowed. "Because you're my son, and I've already missed too many firsts." Caleb sat beside him. For a moment, the air was still. "Paul came to see Mom," Caleb said suddenly. "He said he'd put me in a better school, that he had more money, that he'd keep me safe." Edward clenched his hands slowly. "Did you believe him?" Caleb shrugged. "I didn't know what to think, but then I remembered something Mom told me once." "What was that?" "That real family doesn't buy their way in. They show up." Edward blinked back tears. Caleb glanced at the toy again. "Is this for me?" Edward smiled. "Only if you'll help me make more." The boy's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not yet, but close. That night, back at Anna's apartment, the three of them sat around a table cluttered with takeout containers, toy blueprints, and loose screws. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. Anna watched Edward as he listened to Caleb explain his latest toy prototype, his eyes focused and proud. She leaned over. "You really walked away from the deal?" "I did," Edward said without flinching. "I meant what I said, Anna. Caleb deserves better than half my attention." She looked at him, long and hard. "I still don't trust you completely." "I know. But he's starting to." Edward nodded. "That's more than I deserve." Outside, wind rustled through the narrow alleyway. Inside, laughter filled the room. On the table between them, the toy truck sat quietly, a symbol of something bigger than business. Legacy. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet space as Edward sat on the living room floor, tools and toy parts scattered around him like puzzle pieces. Caleb was hunched over a wooden block, his brows furrowed in deep concentration. The apartment smelled faintly of pine and sawdust, the result of their afternoon project, building something together for the first time. It had been 2 days since Edward walked away from the merger. 2 days since he chose family over fortune. And now, for the first time, Caleb had stopped pulling away. Edward looked over. "What's that piece for?" he asked gently. Caleb didn't answer at first. He was carving something into the underside of a small wooden plane. His lips moved silently as he traced each letter with care. Finally, he held it up, eyes searching Edward's face. "It's for you." Edward reached for the toy, then paused as he turned it over in his palm. His throat tightened. Carved, not with perfect symmetry but with unmistakable heart, was a single word. Family. Edward swallowed hard. "You made this for me?" Caleb nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. You said you used to build things too, so I thought we could start with something small. Edward blinked away the moisture in his eyes. You have no idea what this means to me. I think I do, Caleb said, tilting his head. It's not about toys. It's about showing up, right? Edward exhaled shakily. Exactly. The moment hung between them like a breath held too long. Then Caleb reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I keep sketches, he explained. Toy ideas, parts I find. Sometimes I think up stories for them too. Edward opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. Drawings of robots with secret compartments, cars that transformed into animals, even a series of superheroes made from recycled parts. One was named the Fixer, with wild hair and tired eyes. He kind of looks like me, Edward murmured. Caleb smirked. I was mad when I drew him, but I kept him because, well, even broken things can be fixed. Edward chuckled, his voice thick. That's the best origin story I've ever heard. That evening, Anna found them both asleep on the couch, Caleb curled under Edward's arm, the wooden plane on his chest. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her expression unreadable. Later, as she tucked a blanket around Caleb, she whispered, He used to sleep with his toys when he was scared. Edward stirred. He fell asleep telling me about his workshop idea. Anna smiled faintly. He's never shared that with anyone, not even me. Edward sat up, his voice low. I think he's starting to believe I mean it. You do, she said softly. I can see that now. They stood in silence a moment, the weight of a decade lost pressing gently on their shoulders. Anna, he said hesitantly, I want to file for custody, not to take him away, just to be recognized as his father. Her eyes searched his face, wary and tender at once. Do you think you're ready for that responsibility? He nodded. I gave up $1 billion deal this week. I don't care if I ever make that money back, but I won't lose him again. Anna looked down at the plane in Caleb's arms. Her expression softened. I'll support that, she said quietly, on one condition. What's that? Don't make promises you can't keep, not to me, but especially not to him. Edward nodded, slowly, solemnly. I won't. The next morning, Edward returned to his office to a storm of backlash. The merger collapse had shaken investor confidence. The press spun narratives about instability, failure, sentimentality. But Edward didn't flinch. He stood in front of the board, presented a pared-down business plan, and said the words no one expected. I'm shifting focus from expansion to foundation, from scale to purpose. Paul, noticeably absent from the meeting, had gone quiet since his failed motion to claim temporary custody, but Edward knew it wasn't over, not yet. That night, a small package arrived at Edward's condo. No note, just an old envelope tucked beneath it, one he instantly recognized. Anna's handwriting. Inside was the toy plane, but this time it had something new etched on the wing. Dad. Edward held it in his hands for a long time, breath stilling, eyes closed. He wasn't fixed, but he was being rebuilt, piece by piece. Edward sat in the park's shaded corner, watching Caleb race his handmade wind-up car down the cracked cement path. The wooden wheels squeaked, but the grin on Caleb's face made the sound almost musical. Edward held the toy airplane in his hands, the one with Dad carved into the wing, and tried not to let the emotion rise too high in his chest. It was evening now. The Denver skyline shimmered behind them, and the chill in the air whispered that fall was coming. Edward knew a different kind of season was changing too. Anna sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on her son. I didn't think this day would come, Edward said softly, where he'd look at me like that, like I mattered. Anna didn't smile. She was still cautious, still guarded, but her voice, when it came, held no bitterness. He always wondered why he didn't have a dad like the other kids at school, she said. I told him you were far away, doing important things. I was, Edward admitted, his voice low, but none of them were more important than this. He turned toward her. I want to file for legal custody, not to take him from you, not to change your life. I want to be his father, Anna, officially, permanently, the way I should have been from the start. She looked down at her hands. Her silence stretched long enough that Edward started to fear the worst. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he added. I know I didn't come looking when I should have, but I'm here now, and I'm staying. Anna finally met his gaze. There was no anger there now, only the soft weight of years lost. I believe you, she said quietly. Edward's breath caught. I needed to see it first, she continued. You walking away from that deal, the hours you've spent with him, the way you listen. You're not trying to buy him, you're trying to be there. He nodded, afraid if he spoke his voice might crack. You can be his father, she said. We'll make it official. I won't stand in the way. Edward exhaled like he'd been underwater and finally surfaced. Thank you, he whispered. But, she added gently, this doesn't mean we're picking up where we left off. He blinked, startled. I know, he said, steadying himself. I'm not here to rewrite our past, Anna. I just want a future with him, and whatever support you'll let me give. She nodded, then looked toward Caleb, who was now kneeling on the ground, adjusting his toy car. He told me last night he wants to build a workshop, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Called it Hayes & Son. Said maybe you'd help him make toys for other kids who can't afford them. Edward stared at her. He said that? She nodded. He's already thinking about legacy. Edward ran a hand over his face. He's more me than I deserve. And more than just you, Anna said softly. He's his own person, but you being in his life, it completes something. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Caleb ran over, holding up the wind-up car with one wheel askew. Dad, he said, casually, naturally, without hesitation. Can we fix this together? Edward froze. He'd heard the word before from Caleb, once whispered into sleep, but this time it was different. Spoken with trust. He took the car from his son's hand and smiled. Yeah, buddy, he said, his voice thick. Let's fix it together. Later that night, Edward returned to his condo and placed the wooden plane beside his bedside lamp. He sat for a long time, staring at it. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from his lawyer confirmed the first steps had been filed. Joint custody motion, with Anna's signature. But there was another message waiting, too. From an unknown number. It was a screenshot, one of the deleted messages Anna had sent him years ago. The subject line read, "You have a son." Beneath it, a caption. Thought this might come back to haunt you. Paul. Edward stared at it, pulse quickening. The past wasn't finished with him yet. The moment Edward saw Paul's message, the screenshot of Anna's long-buried email with its cruel caption, something inside him shifted. Not in anger, not anymore, but in clarity. Paul hadn't just betrayed him. He'd robbed a boy of a father, a woman of support, and Edward himself of a decade he couldn't reclaim. But Edward wouldn't let Paul take anything more. The next morning, Edward stood outside Anna's apartment holding the printed message. He hadn't slept, but his resolve was iron. Anna opened the door, still in her hoodie, Caleb brushing his teeth in the background. Her brows furrowed when she saw Edward's face. Is everything okay? she asked, stepping aside. Edward handed her the paper. "I think it's time we bring everything into the light." Anna scanned the message, her lips parted, eyes hardening. So he knew. He really knew all along. "He did," Edward said quietly, "and he kept every message from reaching me." Anna walked to the kitchen table, pulling open a drawer. She rifled through until she found an old flash drive wrapped in a rubber band. "I kept this," she said. "All the messages, the originals, screenshots from my old account, in case I ever needed to prove I tried." She plugged it into her laptop. On screen, a string of messages appeared. Her pleas for a response, her update when Caleb was born, even a photo of baby Caleb holding a small stuffed bear. Edward sat beside her. The photo stopped him cold. Caleb couldn't have been more than 4 months old, eyes wide, fists curled. The bear, Edward's gift to Anna years ago, was tucked under his chin. Anna didn't look at Edward. She stared at the screen with a trembling jaw. "I was alone. He made sure of it." Edward reached over and gently covered her hand. Not anymore. By noon, they were in a lawyer's office. Anna handed over the flash drive. The attorney, a woman in her 50s with a calm presence, examined the files, then nodded. "This is more than enough to demonstrate obstruction and manipulation," she said. "You'll want to file a formal grievance with your company's board." Edward exhaled. "That's what I was afraid of." Anna looked up. "You still plan to stay?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I built that company with Paul, but I won't let it become his legacy. Or mine." The lawyer leaned forward. "With your permission, I can draft a full disclosure statement. This won't just impact the custody hearing. It'll shake the foundation of your firm." Edward nodded slowly. "Let it." That evening, the boardroom at Hayes & Hunt buzzed with murmurs as Edward entered. Paul stood at the far end, smiling coolly, surrounded by senior partners. His suit was pressed, his eyes confident. Edward placed a folder on the conference table. "Before we proceed, I want this entered into the record." A silence fell as the board chair, Miriam, an old family friend, opened the folder. She blinked at the printed messages, then looked at the flash drive. "What is this?" she asked, voice sharp. "Evidence," Edward said, voice even. "Proof that Paul intercepted personal correspondence meant for me, that he withheld knowledge of my son, that he obstructed a potential legal obligation, knowingly and repeatedly." Paul's expression faltered. "That's ridiculous." But Miriam didn't look at Paul. "Did you?" she asked quietly. Paul hesitated. "It was complicated. I was trying to protect Edward." "You protected yourself," Edward interrupted, "from losing control, from facing consequences." Paul stepped forward. "This is a family matter." Miriam shook her head. "Not anymore. You altered company correspondence to manipulate a shareholder and suppress legal liability. This is a breach of ethics." Paul's mouth opened, closed again. He reached for the papers. "You'll be suspended pending formal investigation," Miriam continued, "effective immediately." The room was dead silent. Paul's shoulders sagged, his mask slipping. Edward watched him, not with triumph, but with sorrow. "This didn't have to happen," Edward said softly. "We could have done this together." Paul looked at him, and for the first time in years, he looked small. "You were always the favorite. I was just keeping what you didn't deserve." Edward didn't respond. Some wounds didn't need answers. Later that night, Edward sat beside Caleb's bed. The boy was asleep, his hand resting on a new toy he'd built that day, a bird with moving wings, painted in soft blues. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photo Anna had shown him. Caleb as a baby. The bear. The promise he never got to keep. Until now. He placed the photo gently on the nightstand, then kissed his son's forehead. He whispered, "We're just getting started." The quiet hum of saws, laughter, and tiny gears turning filled the air as sunlight spilled through the wide pane windows of a converted brick building on the east side of Denver. Edward Hayes stood near the entrance of the new workshop, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled, watching Caleb teach two younger boys how to make a wooden race car. The room smelled like pine shavings and fresh paint, and the tables were scattered with toy parts, rubber wheels, plastic fins, paintbrushes, wires, glue guns. The plaque above the door read simply, "The Hayes and Hart's Toy Workshop, free for all kids, every Saturday." It had been Caleb's idea. "Not every kid has a dad who can buy toys," he'd said shyly one night, tracing the word family on the gift he'd given Edward. "But they can still build them, like I used to." That memory stayed with Edward. It had stirred something deeper than guilt, something like purpose. Now, weeks after Paul's suspension and the public fallout that followed, Edward had stepped down from daily operations at his company. Not out of shame, but choice. He'd chosen to build something smaller, something truer, something that fit in his son's hands. Anna stepped beside him now, holding 2 paper cups of cocoa. "Still not used to seeing you in jeans," she teased, offering him one. He chuckled. "Still not used to not having a board meeting every morning." She smiled, but it was gentle, distant, comfortable. Edward accepted that too. After everything, she had drawn her boundary. Firm, but fair. They were co-parents, not lovers, and yet they were something more than strangers, something stronger than old regrets. They were building a bridge, slowly, plank by plank. Caleb ran up, holding a painted helicopter. "Look, Mom! I figured out the rotor with Edward's rubber band trick." Anna ruffled his hair. "You mean your dad's trick?" Caleb blinked, then turned to Edward. "Is it okay if I call you Dad now? I mean, if you still want that?" Edward knelt, eyes damp with awe. "It's all I've ever wanted, Caleb." Caleb grinned. Then, serious again, he pulled something from his pocket, a folded drawing on construction paper. Edward opened it carefully. It was a sketch. Him, Caleb, and Anna standing in front of the toy workshop. The sign above them wasn't the real one. It was handwritten in marker, crooked and bright. Home. "I didn't know what to write," Caleb said softly, "so I just drew how it feels." Edward swallowed hard. "You got it exactly right." That afternoon, as kids poured in and volunteers handed out supplies, Edward gave a short speech at the front of the room, not into a microphone, just to those close enough to hear. "I spent my life building a company," he began, his voice steady. "But I missed building the one thing that matters more than anything, connection. This place, it isn't about toys. It's about giving kids what I almost lost." He looked at Caleb. A chance, a voice, a safe place to say who they are. A small boy raised his hand. "Can we build dragons next week?" Everyone laughed. Edward nodded. "Absolutely. Every dragon needs a home." As the sun dipped behind the Denver skyline, casting the room in gold, Edward stood beside Caleb by the door, waving goodbye to each child as they left with their handmade creations clutched tight. Caleb leaned against him, tired but smiling. "You know what I think?" "What's that?" Edward asked. "I think you were meant to find me." Edward wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders. "I think you were the one who found me." They stood in silence, watching the last child skip down the steps, her wind-up ladybug buzzing in her palm. Then Caleb whispered, "Do you think Paul will ever be sorry?" Edward hesitated. "I don't know, but I hope so." Caleb nodded. "Me too." Inside, Anna dimmed the lights and shut off the last glue gun. Edward looked around the space. Walls now filled with shelves of child-built inventions, their names scrawled underneath. Paper airplanes, tiny robots, marble runs, wobbly towers. Legacy didn't need a fortune. It needed faith, love, forgiveness, and room for children to dream. Outside, under the first stars of evening, Edward, Anna, and Caleb walked home together. No titles, no headlines, just three people carrying cocoa cups and a shared past no longer broken, but rebuilt. Ahead, Caleb ran toward a puddle and jumped over it, his laughter trailing behind. Edward turned to Anna. "He's got your courage." She smiled. "And your stubbornness." They both laughed, then walked on, following the echo of small feet and a boy's dream, a dream that had changed everything.